Over on Earth 10,005, a different kind of conflict was brewing, one that would shape the future of mutant kind for generations. Now, if you haven't figured it out by now, Earth 10,005 is the world of the mutants, and we should probably talk about what that actually means. See, in this universe, some humans are born with something called the X gene, a genetic mutation that gives them extraordinary abilities. Some can control fire, some can read minds, some can walk through walls. These powers usually show up during adolescence, often triggered by stress or trauma. The people who carry this gene are called mutants, and for most of human history, they've been hiding in the shadows, afraid of what would happen if the world found out what they really were. Charles Xavier was born into wealth and privilege, but his life was far from ordinary. From a young age, he discovered he could hear the thoughts of everyone around him. He was a telepath, one of the most powerful the world had ever seen. Instead of hiding from his gift, Charles dedicated his life to studying mutation. He earned degrees from Oxford and became an expert in genetic science, all while dreaming of a future where mutants and humans could live together in peace. Remember Erik, the boy who discovered his powers in the camps during the darkest chapter of human history? By 1962, he had spent nearly 2 decades hunting down the men responsible for what happened to him and his family. His search eventually led him to Sebastian Shaw, the scientist who had taken everything from him. Shaw wasn't just a scientist anymore. He had become something far more dangerous. See, Shaw was a mutant himself. He had the ability to absorb any energy directed at him and use it to make himself stronger. Bullets, explosions, even punches. The more you hit him, the more powerful he became. And over the years, Shaw had built an organization called the Hellfire Club, a secret group of powerful mutants who had infiltrated the highest levels of government and military on both sides of the Cold War. Shaw's plan was simple but terrifying. He had positioned himself to manipulate both the Americans and the Soviets, pushing them closer and closer to the edge. His goal was to trigger a nuclear war, let the humans wipe each other out, and in the ashes, mutants would rise as the dominant species on Earth. When the CIA discovered something strange was happening behind the scenes of the Cold War, they reached out to Charles for help. Now, if you don't know what that is, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. In 1962, the Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. When the Americans found out, they demanded the missiles be removed. For 13 days, the entire world held its breath as the two superpowers stared each other down, each one daring the other to blink first. One wrong move, and it would have been the end of everything. What nobody knew was that Sebastian Shaw was pulling the strings the whole time. A CIA agent named Moira McTaggart had discovered mutants working with Shaw and brought Charles in to help investigate. While tracking Shaw to his yacht, Charles found Erik for the first time. Erik had tracked Shaw there too and was about to confront him alone. Shaw's mutants overpowered Erik and left him to drown in the ocean. Charles sensed Erik's mind in the water and reached out to him telepathically, convincing him to let go before he drowned. It was the first time either of them had met another mutant like themselves. The two men couldn't have been more different. Charles was optimistic and believed in the good in people. Erik had seen the worst of humanity and trusted no one. But they shared one thing. They were both mutants in a world that feared them. Charles brought Erik back to the CIA's Secret Division X facility. There, using a prototype of a device called Cerebro that could locate mutants anywhere in the world, Charles and Erik began recruiting together. This was the moment Charles formed his first squad, young people who had been hiding their abilities, afraid of what would happen if anyone found out. Charles and Erik offered them something they had never had before, a place where they belonged. The mission came together at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Shaw had orchestrated the entire standoff, and now American and Soviet warships were facing each other in the Caribbean, moments away from starting a global conflict. The team tracked Shaw's submarine to the blockade line, and Erik used his powers to pull the entire submarine out of the ocean and onto a nearby beach. That's where everything changed. They stopped the missiles, and Erik finally got his chance to settle the score. He went inside the wrecked submarine to find Shaw, but when he got there, he realized why Charles couldn't reach Shaw's mind. Shaw was wearing a helmet. See, what we didn't mention earlier is that the Russians had gifted Shaw a very special piece of technology, a helmet designed to block telepathy completely. As long as Shaw wore it, Charles couldn't touch him. Erik ripped the helmet off Shaw's head, and the moment he did, Charles froze Shaw in place so they could capture him. But Erik had other plans. He put the helmet on himself, blocking Charles out completely. And while Shaw couldn't move, Erik slowly pushed the same coin that Shaw had used against him as a child. The coin he couldn't move the day his mother was taken from him, straight through Shaw's head. Charles felt every moment of it through their psychic link. He begged Erik to stop, but with the helmet on, Erik couldn't hear him. Shaw was gone, and a part of Charles and Erik's friendship went with him. That helmet would become Magneto's signature. From that day forward, it was the one thing that kept Charles out of his head. But the battle wasn't over. When the American and Soviet fleets saw what the mutants were capable of, they made a decision. Both sides turned their weapons on the beach, not on each other, but on the mutants. Every missile, every gun aimed right at them. Erik stopped them all. He held the barrage in the air with his powers, and then he did something Charles begged him not to do. He turned the missiles around and aimed them back at the ships. Moira tried to stop him. She took a shot at Erik, but he deflected it without even looking. One of them ricocheted and hit Charles in the spine. In an instant, Charles Xavier lost the use of his legs. He would never walk again. That moment changed everything. Erik looked at the humans who had just tried to end them, even after the mutants had saved the world, and saw the truth he had always known. Humanity would never accept them. They would always be feared, hated, pushed aside. Charles still believed coexistence was possible. Erik no longer did. The two friends parted ways that day. Erik took the mutants who shared his vision and formed the Brotherhood, an organization dedicated to mutant supremacy by any means necessary. Charles returned home and founded Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, a sanctuary where young mutants could learn to control their powers and find their place in a world that wasn't ready for them. The mutant schism had begun. Two men who could have been brothers became the leaders of opposing ideologies, and the conflict between them would echo through decades of mutant history. But we'll get back to their story later. Meanwhile, in the 1960s, another universe was telling its own story, one that looked nothing like ours. On Earth 828, the world had taken a very different path. This wasn't a planet scarred by global conflict or frozen by Cold War paranoia. Without the horrors of 2 world wars, civilization had leaped ahead. The cities gleamed with retro-futuristic architecture. Technology was decades beyond anything Earth 616 had achieved, and humanity had already turned its eyes toward the stars. It was a world of optimism, of progress, of possibility, and it was about to meet its first heroes. Dr. Reed Richards was a genius, not the kind who locked himself away in a lab, but the kind who believed science could solve anything if you were brave enough to push the boundaries. A polymath with degrees in astrophysics, engineering, and mathematics, Reed had done something no one else on Earth 828 had managed. He built the world's first functioning spaceship. His wife, Dr. Sue Storm, an archaeologist and diplomat, served as mission specialist. Sue's younger brother, Johnny Storm, signed on as flight engineer, a hotshot with more confidence than caution. And Ben Grimm, Reed's oldest friend and a man as dependable as bedrock, took the pilot's seat. Their launch aboard the Excelsior was a moment of global celebration, humanity's first real step into the cosmos. It should have been a triumph. Instead, somewhere in the depths of space, a storm of celestial radiation caught them, bombarding their ship with energy unlike anything Earth's scientists had ever encountered. Reed had miscalculated the intensity, and the radiation tore through their bodies. They barely made it home alive. But when they crashed back to Earth, they were different. Reed could stretch his body into any shape imaginable. They called him Mr. Fantastic. Sue could turn invisible and project powerful force fields, the Invisible Woman. Johnny could ignite his entire body in flames and fly, the Human Torch. And Ben got the worst of it. His body was transformed into a massive, rock-skinned figure of incredible strength. He became the Thing. He couldn't turn it off. He couldn't go back to who he was. But he could protect the people he loved, and that's what he chose to do. The 4 of them became Earth 828's greatest and only heroes. They called themselves the Fantastic Four, and they founded the Future Foundation, an organization dedicated to global peace, scientific advancement, and the protection of their world. Reed's inventions pushed technology forward. Sue's diplomacy brought nations together, even brokering peace with underground civilizations. For 4 years, they were everything their planet needed. The world loved them. Then, in 1964, everything changed. Sue was pregnant with their first child, and the world was celebrating the Fantastic Four's 4th anniversary when the sky above New York lit up. A silver figure descended into Times Square, a woman on a surfboard-like craft, her skin metallic, her expression unreadable. She announced that Earth had been marked. A being called Galactus, the devourer of worlds, was coming, and when he arrived, he would consume the entire planet. Every city, every ocean, every life, gone. The Fantastic Four didn't panic. They investigated. Reed traced the Silver Surfer's energy signal and cross-referenced it with the disappearance of 5 other planets across the cosmos. Every world the Surfer had visited was gone. The math was undeniable. Galactus was real, he was coming, and Earth was next. So the team made a decision. They stood before the world and announced that they were going back to space. Not to run, but to find Galactus and try to reason with him before he reached their planet. They launched aboard the Excelsior, and what they found was beyond anything they had imagined. A cosmic entity that predated their universe, ancient beyond comprehension, driven by an eternal hunger that could never be satisfied. He had already consumed countless worlds. Earth was next. But then Galactus sensed something. Sue was pregnant, and the child she carried, a boy they would name Franklin Richards, possessed something extraordinary. The power cosmic. Even unborn, Franklin's potential was so vast that Galactus himself took notice. He offered the Fantastic Four a deal. Give him the child, and he would spare Earth. Franklin would inherit Galactus's cursed hunger, freeing the Devourer from his endless cycle of consumption. Reed and Sue refused. No deal, no negotiation. They would not trade their son for the world, and they would not let the world burn either. They would find another way. What followed was a desperate fight for survival. The team escaped Galactus's ship, but the Silver Surfer pursued them across space. To shake her, they slung the Excelsior around a black hole at unimaginable speed, and in the middle of all of it, Galactus forced Sue into labor. Between the stress of the chase, the gravitational forces, and a cosmic entity reaching across space to claim her child, Sue gave birth to Franklin Richards in zero gravity, aboard a ship hurtling through the cosmos with an alien hunter on their tail. When they finally returned to Earth, they had to face the hardest truth. They hadn't beaten Galactus. He was still coming. And the public, terrified and angry, turned on the family that had chosen their child over the planet's safety. But Reed didn't stop. Now, what we haven't mentioned yet is that long before any of this happened, Reed had been working on something in his lab, a teleportation system. It started small, really small. He was moving tiny objects across short distances, testing whether organic matter could survive the process. It was experimental, unfinished, and nowhere near ready for anything beyond a tabletop demonstration. But now, with Galactus bearing down on them and no way to fight a being that had existed since before their universe, Reed looked at his little teleportation experiment and asked himself the craziest question imaginable. What if he scaled it up? Not to move an object, not to move a person, to move the entire planet. He designed massive teleportation bridges, structures that could be built at key locations around the globe, synchronized to generate a warp field powerful enough to transport Earth itself to another solar system, somewhere Galactus couldn't reach them. Through the Future Foundation, Sue rallied the world's nations to cooperate, building the bridges and conserving the energy needed to power them. For a moment, it looked like it might actually work. Then, the Silver Surfer came back. She tore across the globe, taking out bridge after bridge, dismantling their only hope of escape. By the time she reached Times Square, it was the last one standing. And here's where Johnny Storm, of all people, became the hero no one expected. See, back when the Silver Surfer first arrived in Times Square, she had spoken to Johnny in her own language, a strange, alien phrase that no one could understand. Anyone else would have moved on. But something about that moment stuck with Johnny. He became obsessed with figuring out what she had said. He started digging through deep space transmissions that Reed had intercepted, recordings that contained the same language. Night after night, while Reed was building teleportation bridges and Sue was rallying the world, Johnny was sitting alone, listening to alien signals, piecing together a language that no human had ever spoken. And slowly, word by word, he cracked it. So when he intercepted the Surfer at that last bridge, he didn't fight her, he talked to her. In her own language, he learned her name, Shalla-Bal, and her story. She wasn't a conqueror. She was a woman from a peaceful world called Zen-La, who had given herself to Galactus to spare her own planet and her family from being consumed. She had been leading him to world after world ever since, carrying the weight of every civilization she helped erase. With only one bridge left, Reed had no choice but to go with a plan no one wanted. See, Galactus didn't travel alone. He relied on a massive world ship to cross the cosmos, locate planets, and consume them. Without that ship, he was stranded. So Reed's idea was simple but terrifying. Lure Galactus himself, not his ship, to Times Square, and use the last remaining bridge to teleport him to the far side of the universe, millions of light years from his vessel. Stranded, alone, with no way to reach Earth or any other world. But to lure a cosmic entity who only cared about one thing, they needed the one thing he wanted: Franklin. They would use their newborn son as bait. It was desperate, dangerous, and it required the family to put their child in the line of fire. But it was the only option left. Galactus landed in New York. He carved a path through the city, heading straight for Franklin. The Fantastic Four threw everything they had at him. Sue pushed herself beyond her limits, using her force fields to shove a cosmic god toward the open portal. Reed saved Franklin from Galactus's grip. Ben held the ground. Johnny was ready to give his own life to finish the job. But it was Shalla-Bal who ended it. Johnny had shown her the truth. He played back the final transmissions of the civilizations she had helped consume, the voices of the worlds she had led Galactus to. She heard their last moments, and something in her broke. When Johnny prepared to sacrifice himself to push Galactus through the portal, Shalla-Bal stopped him. She took his place. With everything she had left, she drove both herself and Galactus through the teleportation bridge and into the void. The portal closed behind them. Earth was saved. But Sue had collapsed. She had pushed her powers past the breaking point, and for a moment, she was gone. Then, baby Franklin, lying on his mother's chest, did something impossible. His power awakened, and he brought her back. The Fantastic Four survived. They had faced something that should have been the end of everything, and they had done it as a family. But their story on Earth 828 was far from over, and the wider multiverse had taken notice. But we'll get back to their story later. By the 1970s, on Earth 616, the Winter Soldier was at his most active. Hydra, the organization everyone believed had been destroyed after the war, had quietly survived, infiltrating governments, intelligence agencies, and even S.H.I.E.L.D. itself, and the Winter Soldier was their most valuable tool. Throughout the Cold War, he moved like a phantom, destabilizing regimes, reshaping the global balance of power, and vanishing before anyone could prove he existed. He was arguably the most dangerous operative on the planet, and no one even knew his name. It's also worth noting that 1970 is the year two familiar faces from the future briefly passed through Camp Lehigh, the same military base where Steve Rogers trained before becoming Captain America, now housing a secret S.H.I.E.L.D. facility. Tony Stark and Steve Rogers, traveling back in time as part of a desperate mission decades from now, came here to retrieve the Tesseract and something called PIM particles. We'll get into why when the time comes. But just know, 1970 wasn't only shaped by the ghosts of the past, the future left its fingerprints here too. And speaking of Camp Lehigh, in 1972, something happened in that same facility that no one would discover for decades. Arnim Zola, the Hydra scientist who had been quietly recruited by the United States after the war through Operation Paperclip, received a terminal diagnosis. His body was failing. But Zola had been planning for this. Using S.H.I.E.L.D.'s own resources, he transferred his entire consciousness into a massive computer system hidden deep within the base. Hundreds of databanks preserving every thought, every memory, every scheme. His body passed, but his mind lived on in the machine. And from inside that machine, Zola continued doing what he had been doing since the day the Allies thought they'd won. Growing Hydra like a virus inside S.H.I.E.L.D., recruiting, corrupting, and preparing for the day the parasite would finally consume its host.